Sandra Mills leaned back in her sleek, ergonomic office chair, allowing herself a small smile of satisfaction as she surveyed the polished expanse of her office. The towering glass windows framed the city's skyline, a testament to her position as the manager of one of the most exclusive bank branches in the state. Every detail of the room spoke to the reputation she had cultivated: precision, success, and a certain level of unattainability. Her desk was immaculate, not a single paper out of place. A bouquet of white lilies rested on one corner, their elegant stems perfectly aligned, a weekly gift she ordered for herself. Everything in Sandra's world was controlled, from her tailored navy blazer to the glossy sheen of her blonde hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. She thrived on the exclusivity of her clientele. Her branch didn't just serve anyone, it was a haven for the elite, where fortunes were whispered over premium espressos and the weight of wealth was carried in designer briefcases. Sandra had worked for years to build her reputation as a gatekeeper to financial luxury. She didn't just manage accounts, she curated a world where the rich felt untouchable. This morning, Sandra had just finished her routine pep talk to her team, a group she referred to as curators of wealth and truth. She mostly met herself. "Remember," she said, clasping her hands in front of her, "our clients are not just customers, they are individuals of prestige. They demand discretion, respect, and the highest level of service. It's our job to ensure they receive nothing less." As the team dispersed, Sandra allowed her eyes to flick over each of them. There was Rachel, the eager but somewhat clumsy intern Victor, a senior associate whose charm barely masked his tendency to crack under pressure, and Alicia, Sandra's right-hand woman and the only employee she trusted implicitly. None of them, Sandra believed, fully grasped the significance of maintaining the branch's exclusivity. Sandra's philosophy was simple: wealth wasn't just about money, it was about presence, appearance, and the ability to command respect without asking for it. Those who didn't possess these qualities didn't belong in her branch. She'd made that clear through countless unspoken rules. A client wearing a suit tailored in Milan? They'd get her personal attention. Someone in sneakers and a hoodie? She didn't have time for them. At that moment, Alicia appeared at the door. "Ms. Mills, there's someone at the front desk asking for assistance. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent." Sandra's perfectly arched brow lifted. "Does he look out of place?" she asked, her tone measured but laced with condescension. Alicia hesitated. "He's, casually dressed." Sandra's lips tightened. "Of course. I'll handle it," she said, rising from her chair with an air of importance. As she approached the lobby, Sandra scanned the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She spotted the man immediately. He stood near the reception desk, his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark windbreaker, his jeans slightly frayed at the hem. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet confidence, but to Sandra, his attire spoke volumes. He doesn't belong here. The receptionist, a nervous young woman named Emily, glanced at Sandra with relief. "Ms., this is Mr. Owens. He's looking to discuss some financial matters with one of our senior advisors." Sandra didn't hide her disdain as she turned to the man. "Mr. Owens," she said, her voice clipped. "This branch typically handles appointments only. If you don't have one, I'm afraid you'll need to visit one of our standard locations." Charles Owens met her gaze calmly. "I was hoping someone could assist me today. It's regarding my accounts here." Sandra bristled at his even tone. She hated when people like this came in, assuming they could bypass protocol. "Your accounts?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "And you're sure you have them here?" Charles didn't flinch. "Yes, I'm sure. I've had accounts here for years." Sandra folded her arms, her skepticism now tinged with irritation. "I find that hard to believe. This branch specializes in high net worth clients. Are you certain you haven't confused us with another location?" Charles's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know exactly where I am." Sandra's tone grew icier. "If you do indeed have accounts here, I'm certain a matter like this can be addressed through our corporate line or with an appointment. As you can see," she gestured to the lobby, empty except for a scattering of impeccably dressed clients and a gleaming chandelier. "We are not a walk-in bank." Emily shifted uncomfortably behind the reception desk, her gaze darting between Charles and Sandra. Alicia, watching from a distance, looked uneasy as well. But Sandra pressed on, her voice gaining a cutting edge. I suggest you make an appointment or take your inquiry to a branch more suited to your needs. Charles stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled faintly, a small, knowing curve of his lips that only unsettled Sandra further. Thank you for your time, he said simply before turning and walking out the door. Sandra watched him leave, a flicker of annoyance dancing across her otherwise composed features. People like him always tried to push boundaries, always assumed they could disrupt the order she had worked so hard to maintain. She turned to Emily, who was still fidgeting nervously. In the future, Sandra said sharply, don't waste my time with cases like that. It's clear he wasn't a fit for this branch. Emily nodded quickly, her cheeks flushed. Sandra adjusted her blazer and strode back to her office, her mind already shifting to more important matters. Inside, Sandra allowed herself a sip of her espresso, savoring the bitter warmth. Her world was orderly again, as it should be. Whatever Mr. Owens thought he could accomplish, she told herself, was no longer her concern. But outside, Charles Owens stepped into the crisp air and pulled out his phone. He tapped a contact and waited for the line to connect. When a voice answered on the other end, Charles's tone was calm but firm. It's me, he said. I need to speak with someone at corporate. We've got a situation at the branch on Fifth Avenue. Sandra Mills had no idea that her day and her carefully constructed world was about to be turned upside down. Sandra Mills had nearly forgotten about the encounter with the casually dressed man by the time the lunchtime hour approached. She was seated at her desk, reviewing the portfolio of one of her most lucrative clients, a luxury property developer known for his flashy investments and even flashier demeanor. People like him were Sandra's bread and butter, clients who didn't just bring in revenue but validated the exclusivity she had worked so hard to protect. She had just finished crafting a congratulatory email regarding his latest acquisition when Alicia knocked lightly on her doorframe. Miss Mills, there's been a request for you to speak with someone from corporate, Alicia said, her tone unusually cautious. Sandra looked up, her brow furrowing. Corporate? About what? I'm not sure, Alicia replied, but the hesitation in her voice gave Sandra pause. They've requested to speak to you directly. Sandra nodded, adjusting her blazer before walking toward the conference room where the branch's secure phone line was housed. As she entered and picked up the receiver, the tone of the day began to shift. Good afternoon. This is Sandra Mills, she said smoothly, expecting the call to be about routine matters. The voice on the other end, low and professional, did not waste time with pleasantries. Ms. Mills, this is Thomas Caldwell, Regional Vice President. I'm calling regarding a client interaction that occurred earlier this morning. Sandra stiffened slightly, her mind racing. A client interaction. Yes, Caldwell said, his tone now heavier with implication. It concerns Mr. Charles Owens. I understand he came into the branch seeking assistance, and you personally declined to serve him. Sandra's chest tightened as she struggled to keep her composure. I recall speaking with a Mr. Owens. He did not have an appointment, and our policy is clear on such matters. We typically do not. Ms. Mills, Caldwell interrupted, his voice sharp now. Are you aware that Mr. Owens is one of our largest account holders? He is the CEO of Owens Technologies, a privately held company that manages assets exceeding $120 million across multiple accounts with our institution. Sandra's grip on the receiver tightened, her thoughts momentarily scattering. He didn't present himself in a manner consistent with our typical clientele, she said finally, scrambling to find her footing. If I had known. That's precisely the issue, Caldwell snapped. Your responsibility as the branch manager is to ensure every client, regardless of their appearance or demeanor, is treated with professionalism and respect. The fact that you failed to recognize Mr. Owens, a key client, and dismissed him so summarily is unacceptable. Sandra's face flushed. She felt an uncharacteristic wave of vulnerability creeping over her, a rare emotion in her otherwise meticulously controlled life. I understand the importance of our clients, she began, trying to regain control of the conversation. I will personally reach out to Mr. Owens and address this matter. You'll do more than that, Caldwell replied curtly. Mr. Owens has requested a meeting with you, myself, and several senior executives tomorrow morning at corporate headquarters. I suggest you prepare an explanation for your actions. We cannot afford to alienate clients of his stature. Sandra swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing against her chest. "Understood," she said, her voice quieter now. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sandra standing in the sterile conference room with the receiver still in her hand. For the first time in years, she felt something she rarely experienced in her professional life: genuine fear. Returning to her office, Sandra forced herself to sit down and take a deep breath. The name Owens Technologies now reverberated in her mind. Of course, she had heard of them, one of the fastest-growing players in the tech industry, rumored to be a pioneer in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Charles Owens had chosen to stay out of the limelight, his name rarely appearing in headlines, but his influence was undeniable in corporate circles. How could she have missed the signs? Her arrogance had blinded her, and now the consequences of that oversight were unfolding faster than she could control. Sandra opened her laptop and began frantically researching Charles Owens. Images of the man she had dismissed stared back at her: a polished figure in tailored suits at high-profile conferences, a smiling philanthropist at charity galas, and occasionally a private but unassuming man photographed during community outreach programs. The man she had met this morning bore none of the markers of the powerful individual she now knew him to be. The realization stung. She hadn't bothered to look beyond her assumptions. As she sat there trying to formulate a plan, Alicia reappeared at her door. "Ms. Mills," she said hesitantly, "Mr. Owens is back." Sandra's heart skipped a beat. "He's here." Alicia nodded. "He's asked to speak with you." For the first time in years, Sandra felt a chill of uncertainty. She smoothed her blazer, stood, and prepared to face the man who had already started unraveling her meticulously crafted world. Sandra Mills hesitated at the threshold of her office, her usually unshakable confidence faltering. Charles Owens was back, waiting in the lobby, and this time she couldn't dismiss him as an irrelevant walk-in. The gravity of her earlier mistake weighed heavily on her as she forced herself to walk toward the reception area. The atmosphere in the lobby was tense. Charles stood near the same desk where their first encounter had occurred, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. He was no longer the man who had walked in earlier that morning. There was an unmistakable air of power about him now. His calm demeanor exuded a quiet authority, as though he had all the time in the world and yet knew how to make every second count. Sandra squared her shoulders, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached him. "Mr. Owens," she said, her tone measured and professional, "I understand you've returned to discuss your concerns. Why don't we step into my office?" Charles glanced at her, his expression unreadable, and nodded. Without a word, he followed her through the immaculate corridors to her office. As they entered, Sandra gestured for him to take a seat, but Charles remained standing, his hands clasped casually in front of him. "I'd like to start by apologizing for our earlier interaction," Sandra began, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "It seems there was a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," Charles repeated, his voice low but firm. He tilted his head slightly, fixing her with a piercing gaze. "Interesting choice of words, Ms. Mills. I don't think it was a misunderstanding. It was a judgment." Sandra felt her cheeks flush. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself momentarily speechless. Charles continued, stepping closer to her desk. "You assumed I didn't belong here," he said. "That I wasn't worth your time or attention because of how I looked. Isn't that right?" Sandra stammered, trying to find the right words. "That's not entirely." "Let's not waste time dancing around the truth," Charles interrupted, his tone calm but unyielding. "I've encountered this kind of treatment before, Ms. Mills. You saw what you wanted to see: a black man in casual clothes who couldn't possibly be worth your effort." The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra felt trapped under his gaze, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. "I didn't come here today to be lectured about my appearance," Charles continued. "I came here as a client of this bank, a long-standing client, I might add, to handle my business, and instead of being treated with respect, I was dismissed and belittled." Sandra swallowed hard, her usual composure slipping further. "Mr. Owens," she said finally, her voice softer now, "I truly regret the way I handled our earlier interaction. It was unprofessional, and it does not reflect the values of this institution." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it seems your institution has allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked." Sandra felt her heart sink. She knew he wasn't wrong. While the bank prided itself on exclusivity, it often blurred the line between serving high-net-worth clients and perpetuating elitism. She had been a gatekeeper of that culture, and now it was coming back to haunt her. Before she could respond, Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He placed a business card on her desk and slid it toward her. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone as steady as ever. "Tomorrow I'll be meeting with your regional vice president and several members of the corporate leadership team. We'll be discussing not only this incident but also the broader implications of how this branch operates. You'll be present, of course." Sandra picked up the card, her hands trembling slightly as she read it. The card bore the logo of Owens Technologies, along with Charles's name and title, founder and CEO. Beneath it was a tagline, "Innovating for a better tomorrow." "I'm not interested in platitudes or empty apologies," Charles said, his voice cutting through the silence. "What I want is accountability. Not just from you, but from the institution you represent." Sandra's stomach churned. She had never been in a situation like this before. Her entire career had been built on maintaining control, yet here she was, completely at the mercy of a man she had underestimated. "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" Charles asked, his tone almost challenging. Sandra hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "Not at this time." Charles nodded once, then turned and walked out of her office without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sandra alone with her thoughts. She sank into her chair, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her like a physical force. As the afternoon wore on, the implications of the meeting began to sink in. Sandra's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. She knew the upcoming meeting with corporate would be pivotal, not just for her career but for the branch's reputation. Unable to focus, she called Alicia into her office. Alicia entered cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. "Alicia," Sandra began, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "I need you to pull all records related to Mr. Owens's accounts. I want a full report on my desk by the end of the day." Alicia nodded. "Of course, Ms. Mills. Is there anything else?" Sandra hesitated, then shook her head. "No, that will be all." As Alicia left, Sandra leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She had always prided herself on her ability to navigate difficult situations, but this felt different. This wasn't just about damage control, it was about reckoning with the consequences of her actions. For the first time in years, Sandra felt truly vulnerable, and she hated it. Meanwhile, Charles sat in his car outside the bank, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he took a deep breath. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected him to be. He was tired. Tired of the assumptions, the microaggressions, and the constant need to prove his worth in spaces that should have been welcoming. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through messages from his team. His assistant had already confirmed the meeting with corporate, and several senior executives had reached out to express their concern. It wasn't the first time Charles had encountered this kind of treatment, but it was one of the few times he had the power to do something about it. Charles started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, his mind already turning to the next steps. This wasn't just about his personal experience, it was about sending a message. Institutions like this needed to change, and he was determined to be part of that change. As he drove away, the city skyline stretched out before him, a reminder of how far he had come and how much further there was to go. By the time Charles Owens returned to his office that evening, the wheels were already in motion. The sleek, minimalist design of Owens Technologies headquarters mirrored its CEO's demeanor, efficient, innovative, and forward-thinking. As Charles stepped off the private elevator, his executive assistant, Lauren, greeted him with a stack of printed reports and an iPad loaded with relevant data. "Everything's ready for the corporate meeting tomorrow," Lauren said, keeping pace with Charles as he walked briskly to his office. "Also, your legal team has reviewed the incident at the bank. They're prepared to issue a formal inquiry to the bank's board if necessary." Charles nodded, his face set with determination. "Thank you, Lauren. What's the status on the social media team's outreach?" Lauren handed him the iPad. "Your tweet from earlier has already gained traction. It's trending, and several high-profile figures have retweeted it. The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive." Charles took the device and scanned the post he'd written an hour earlier. It was simple yet powerful, accompanied by an image of the bank's glass facade. Today I was reminded that appearances often determine the treatment you receive. Even as a longtime client of an institution, I was dismissed based on assumptions. Change begins with accountability. Do better equity in business. Underneath, hundreds of replies poured in, ranging from personal stories of discrimination to calls for boycotts of the bank. Influential voices, activists, business leaders, and even a few celebrities had weighed in, amplifying the story. Charles set the iPad on his desk and sank into his chair. He wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but moments like this demanded action. If his position and influence could bring about systemic change, he owed it to others who couldn't fight back as easily. Keep monitoring the responses, Charles said to Lauren. Let's also prepare a statement for tomorrow. Something that underscores the importance of inclusivity without escalating the situation unnecessarily. Understood, Lauren replied. One more thing, several news outlets have reached out for interviews. How would you like us to handle that? Charles hesitated. He wasn't eager to turn this into a media spectacle, but he also recognized the power of visibility. Tell them we'll issue a statement after tomorrow's meeting, he said finally. No interviews for now. Lauren nodded and left the room, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His mind returned to the moment in the bank when Sandra Mills had dismissed him without a second thought. It wasn't just about her, it was about the culture she represented. And that culture needed to change. Meanwhile, at the bank's Fifth Avenue branch, the fallout had already begun. The regional corporate office had forwarded Charles's social media post to all senior management, setting off a flurry of damage control meetings. Sandra Mills sat in her office, staring at her laptop screen in horror as she read through the flood of comments. This is outrageous, she muttered, scrolling through the replies. Some were outright furious, others disappointed, but all carried the same message: the bank had failed. Sandra's earlier arrogance had dissolved into panic as she realized the full extent of the situation. The phone on her desk buzzed, and she snatched it up. It was Victor, one of her senior advisors. MS. Mills, he said, his voice tight with anxiety. Have you seen the news? The Owens incident is everywhere. It's on local channels, and there's already talk of a boycott. I'm aware, Sandra snapped, her nerves fraying. What's the status of our PR response? Victor hesitated. Corporate is drafting a statement, but they're waiting to see how tomorrow's meeting plays out. They've also suggested we prepare for disciplinary action, just in case. Sandra's grip on the phone tightened. Disciplinary action? Against me? Victor was silent for a moment. MS Mills, you know how these things work. Someone has to take responsibility. Sandra hung up, her heart pounding. She had built her career on maintaining order and exclusivity, but now that very foundation was crumbling beneath her. She glanced at the clock. Less than 12 hours until the meeting with Charles Owens and the corporate leadership team. It would be the most important and possibly the most humiliating meeting of her career. Across the city, discussions about the incident extended far beyond social media. In boardrooms and living rooms, people debated the broader implications of what had occurred. For some, it was a stark reminder of the everyday biases that shaped interactions in professional spaces. For others, it was a wake-up call about the need for systemic accountability. In a small cafe, a group of young entrepreneurs discussed the story over coffee. It's about time someone like Charles Owens called this out, one of them said. Too often, people with power stay silent. True, another replied. But I'm curious to see what the bank does next. If they don't handle this right, it could cost them. Charles had set off a chain reaction, and the full impact was yet to be felt. But one thing was clear: the days of unquestioned gatekeeping and unchecked biases were numbered. The conference room at the corporate headquarters of the bank was a stark contrast to the warm ambience of the Fifth Avenue branch. Here the walls were pristine white, decorated only with minimalist artwork that hinted at innovation and progress. A long, polished mahogany table stretched across the room, lined with sleek leather chairs. The setting was as intimidating as it was impressive. Sandra Mills sat near one end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had arrived early, hoping to collect her thoughts before the others filed in. Her usually sharp appearance now seemed strained. Her suit was perfectly tailored, but her posture betrayed the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. When the door opened, Sandra looked up sharply. Charles Owens entered first, his presence commanding without any effort. He wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored to perfection, and carried himself with an air of calm authority. Behind him followed Thomas Caldwell, the regional vice president, and 3 other senior executives from corporate. "Good morning," Caldwell said briskly, taking his seat at the head of the table. He barely glanced at Sandra before turning his attention to Charles. "Mr. Owens, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today." Charles nodded, lowering himself into a chair opposite Sandra. He placed a folder on the table in front of him but didn't open it. "I appreciate the opportunity," Charles said, his voice measured. "I trust we're here to address the events that took place yesterday." Caldwell nodded. "Indeed. Before we proceed, I'd like to make it clear that this bank values all its clients regardless of their background or appearance. What happened at the Fifth Avenue branch does not reflect our values as an institution." Sandra's cheeks flushed at the not-so-subtle rebuke. She straightened her back, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Mr. Owens," she began, her voice quieter than usual, "I want to personally apologize for my behavior yesterday. It was inappropriate and unprofessional." Charles turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology, Ms. Mills," he said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about the broader issue of how institutions like this perpetuate systemic biases." Sandra's throat tightened. "I assure you, that was not my intent." "It's not about intent," Charles interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "It's about impact. Your assumptions about me weren't just a personal slight, they're a reflection of a culture that values appearances over substance, that decides who's worthy of respect based on arbitrary criteria." Caldwell cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Owens, I'd like to reiterate that the bank takes this matter very seriously. We're conducting a thorough review of the incident and our internal policies to ensure this doesn't happen again." Charles nodded slightly, but his focus remained on Sandra. "Ms. Mills, tell me what made you decide I didn't belong in your branch yesterday." Sandra felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward her. She hesitated, her carefully rehearsed explanations crumbling under the weight of the question. "I made a judgment based on how you were dressed," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake." Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "A mistake," he repeated. "And what would have happened if I were someone without the resources or platform to call attention to that mistake? What if I were just an average person trying to open an account or access my own money?" Sandra didn't have an answer. She lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "This isn't just about one branch or one employee," Charles continued, turning his attention back to Caldwell. "It's about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed at every level of your institution. Training isn't enough. Policies need to change. Accountability needs to be real, not performative." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Caldwell cleared his throat again. "Mr. Owens, we're open to any suggestions you may have for how we can improve. Your feedback is invaluable to us." Charles opened the folder in front of him, revealing a detailed report. "I've outlined several recommendations," he said, sliding the folder across the table. "Mandatory bias training is a start, but it needs to be paired with measurable outcomes. I also suggest implementing a client feedback system so issues like this can be identified and addressed before they escalate." Caldwell nodded, flipping through the report. "These are excellent suggestions," he said. "We'll review them in detail and follow up with you to discuss implementation." Charles stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "I'll be watching closely to see how you follow through," he said, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. "Thank you for your time." As Charles left the room, the weight of his words lingered in the air. Sandra sat frozen in her chair, her heart pounding. She knew that whatever came next, her career would never be the same. The meeting concluded, and the weight of its impact hung heavy in the room long after Charles Owens had left. Sandra Mills sat in silence, her colleagues filing out one by one, their expressions ranging from discomfort to pity. Thomas Caldwell was the last to leave, pausing at the door. "Miss Mills," he said, his tone sharp but not unkind, "corporate will be reviewing your role in this matter." I suggest you take the time to reflect on what happened and how it reached this point." The door clicked shut, leaving Sandra alone in the sterile, imposing conference room. She stared at the folder Charles had left behind, now in Caldwell's possession, and thought about the damning clarity with which he'd spoken. For the first time in years, Sandra felt exposed, not the confident, unshakable manager she had worked so hard to be, but a deeply flawed person caught in the web of her own biases and decisions. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Charles Owens's recommendations quickly gained traction within the bank's leadership. His powerful social media presence and the attention from mainstream news outlets made it impossible for the institution to ignore the issue. A task force was formed to address systemic bias, and corporate announced sweeping changes, including enhanced diversity training, mandatory reporting mechanisms for discriminatory incidents, and a revised code of conduct emphasizing inclusivity. The changes were met with mixed reactions within the organization. Some employees welcomed the reforms, grateful for an opportunity to work in a more equitable environment. Others, however, whispered about Sandra Mills behind closed doors, speculating about her future. While no formal decision had been announced, it was clear her career hung by a thread. For Sandra, the days blurred together in a haze of introspection and uncertainty. She remained on administrative leave while the investigation continued, a punishment that felt both humiliating and just. Without the rigid structure of her job to occupy her time, Sandra was left alone with her thoughts and the uncomfortable realization of just how deeply her biases had shaped her actions. One evening, Sandra found herself scrolling through social media, her feed inundated with posts about the incident. She paused on a video of Charles Owens addressing a crowd at a community center. His voice was calm but passionate as he spoke about the need for systemic change, not just in institutions like banks but in society as a whole. "This isn't about one incident or one person," Charles said. "It's about the countless moments that go unnoticed, the everyday injustices that people face simply because of who they are or how they're perceived. We can't change the past, but we can choose to be better moving forward." Sandra felt a pang of guilt as she listened. Charles wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or mistreated because of assumptions made about their worth. The thought struck a chord deep within her, forcing her to confront the extent of her own privilege and the harm it had caused. A week later, Sandra received a formal email from corporate. The message was brief but clear: her position as manager of the Fifth Avenue branch had been terminated. However, the email also included an offer to participate in a new training program designed to help employees identify and address their biases. The decision felt like both a punishment and an opportunity, a chance to start over, albeit in a much humbler role. Sandra stared at the screen for a long time before replying. She accepted. Months passed, and Sandra began her new role as a compliance officer in the bank's internal audit division. The position was far removed from her previous high-profile job, but it gave her a unique perspective on the institution she had once represented. Her work now involved reviewing cases of discrimination and bias within the company, ensuring that complaints were handled with fairness and transparency. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful. And for the first time in years, Sandra felt she was contributing to something greater than herself. Her journey of reflection and growth wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, moments when she questioned whether she deserved forgiveness, let alone a second chance. But slowly, she began to see the impact of her efforts. Employees who had once been silenced now had a voice, and clients who had faced discrimination were finally being treated with the respect they deserved. One day, as Sandra was leaving the office, she noticed a familiar figure standing by the elevators. It was Charles Owens. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his demeanor as composed as ever. "Mr. Owens," Sandra said, her voice tinged with both surprise and nervousness. Charles turned to her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "MS. Mills," he replied. "Or should I say Compliance Officer Mills?" Sandra chuckled softly, the tension between them easing just slightly. "I suppose that's accurate," she said. "It's good to see you." "Likewise," Charles said. There was a pause, then he added, "I've been following the changes the bank has implemented. It seems like progress is being made." Sandra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I hope so. There's still a long way to go, but I'm trying to do my part." Charles studied her for a moment, then extended a hand. It takes courage to acknowledge your mistakes and work toward change. I respect that. Sandra shook his hand, gratitude flooding through her. Thank you, she said. And thank you for holding us accountable. You didn't have to, but you did. It's made a difference. Charles smiled faintly. It's not about me. It's about what's right. Take care, Ms. Mills. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Sandra stood in the empty hallway, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time she felt she was on the right path. Months later, Charles Owens announced a new initiative through his company, a scholarship fund aimed at increasing diversity in the financial sector. The program was named the Equity Project and quickly garnered support from corporations and individuals alike. Sandra donated anonymously, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment as she watched the initiative grow. The incident at the Fifth Avenue branch became a turning point, not just for Sandra but for the entire institution. Policies were restructured, leaders were held accountable, and the culture began to shift. It wasn't perfect change, rarely is, but it was progress. For Charles, the experience reaffirmed his commitment to advocacy and justice. And for Sandra, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by her past mistakes but by her determination to be better moving forward.